Before Rome carved its empire across Europe, and long before modern nations drew their borders, the continent was a patchwork of tribes. Some of these peoples are well remembered, while others are nearly forgotten. Among them stood two groups whose names still stir curiosity: the Illyrians and the Celts. To the Greeks and Romans, both were fierce, unruly, and difficult to subdue. They were warriors who lived outside the polished world of cities and temples, clinging instead to rugged mountains, dark forests, and windswept plains. But were these two peoples entirely separate, or could there be a deeper connection between them? The Illyrians lived along the eastern coast of the Adriatic and stretched inland into the mountains of the Balkans. They were known as pirates, raiders, and mercenaries, their rugged homeland shaping a people skilled at both land warfare and seafaring. Meanwhile, the Celts, or Gauls as the Romans called them, were spread across vast swathes of Europe, from modern-day Ireland and France to the very gates of Greece itself. They were famed for their daring charges, their ornate weapons, and their ability to appear seemingly everywhere at once. Ancient writers often lumped these peoples together, portraying them as wild, dangerous, and untamed compared to the so-called civilized Greeks and Romans. But beyond these stereotypes lies an intriguing question. Were the Illyrians and the Celts connected by more than just reputation? Could the Illyrians have been an early branch of the same Indo-European migrations that gave rise to the Celts? Or were they entirely distinct, with only superficial similarities that made them appear related to outside observers? This is the mystery at the heart of our story. To answer it, we must journey into the archaeology, the languages, and the history of contact between these two peoples. Because while the Illyrians would eventually fade into obscurity, absorbed into Rome, and remembered only in fragments, the Celts left a legacy that spread from Iberia to Britain. Yet in the shadows of the Balkans, there are clues that hint at possible ties, and a controversy that historians still debate today. When archaeologists study the Illyrians and Celts, they often point to striking similarities in how these peoples lived and fought. Both were tribal rather than centralized states, ruled by chieftains or small kings. Loyalty was tied to kinship, clan, and war bands, not bureaucracies or written law codes. To the Greeks and Romans, this was the mark of barbarism. Yet to modern historians, it shows a cultural pattern that spread widely among Indo-European peoples. And here is where the mystery deepens. One of the strongest areas of overlap lies in material culture. Across Illyria and Celtic Europe, archaeologists have uncovered nearly identical forms of decorated helmets, long iron swords, and distinctive shields. Some burial practices are almost indistinguishable: warrior graves filled with weapons, ornaments, and sometimes even sacrificed horses to accompany the dead into the afterlife. The Celts, through their Hallstatt and Latin cultures, were master metalworkers, producing ornate jewelry and weapons. Yet in the Western Balkans, Illyrian artisans created items of such similar design that scholars debate whether they were borrowing from Celtic neighbours or sharing in a common cultural origin. Language adds another layer of complexity. The Illyrian tongue, now long extinct, survives only in scattered names of tribes, kings, and places. Meanwhile, Celtic languages have echoes that still survive in modern Gaelic, Welsh, and Breton. Some scholars have pointed to parallels between Illyrian names and Celtic ones, suggesting a distant linguistic kinship. But the evidence is frustratingly incomplete. Not enough to declare them the same, yet not so little as to dismiss the possibility of a shared Indo-European root that branched apart in the deep past. Religion and belief systems also reveal overlap. The Celts are remembered for their druids, their sacred groves, and their gods of war, rivers, and the sky. The Illyrians, too, worshipped a pantheon tied closely to nature, deities of the mountains, storms, and sea. Both peoples placed importance on warriors' honor and the symbolism of animals. For instance, the serpent and the horse appear repeatedly in Illyrian religious art, much as they did among Celtic tribes across Europe. These echoes are tantalizing. Were they coincidences born of similar tribal societies, or reflections of a shared ancestral worldview stretching back to a time before history? And then, there is the matter of appearance. Ancient authors like Strabo and Appian sometimes describe the Illyrians in ways that sound eerily similar to their depictions of Celts. Tall, fierce, with wild hair, and a love of ornamentation. Of course, these descriptions often say more about Roman prejudice than actual ethnography. Yet, when combined with archaeological finds, they paint a picture of two peoples who may have looked, dressed, and fought in ways that blurred the lines of identity. It is here that we begin to see the core of the controversy. Were these similarities the product of shared ancestry, making the Illyrians something like Proto-Celts? Or were they simply neighbors exchanging goods, ideas, and styles across trade routes and battlefields? The Balkans were never an isolated corner of Europe. From the north came Celtic migrations, waves of tribes that pushed southward into Central Europe and beyond. By the 4th century BC, Celtic warbands were crossing the Danube and storming into the Balkans, clashing with Illyrian tribes, Greek city-states, and even marching into Asia Minor. This moment of upheaval is crucial to the debate, because it was here that the Illyrians and Celts became entangled in ways that make separating them extremely difficult. Archaeology shows clear evidence of Celtic settlements deep in the Balkans. In fact, entire regions that were once Illyrian suddenly bore the hallmarks of Latin culture, the artistic style most associated with the Celts. Graves filled with Celtic-style swords, shields, and ornaments suggest either that Celts conquered Illyrian territory or that Illyrians themselves adopted Celtic ways. Some tribes may even have merged entirely. To the Greeks and Romans, who often cared little about distinguishing between barbarian groups, the boundaries blurred into one. They spoke of mixed peoples, half Celtic, half Illyrian, inhabiting the rugged frontier lands. Conflict was frequent. The Celts' expansion put pressure on Illyrian tribes, sparking wars for territory and dominance. But alongside the bloodshed came alliances. In some cases, Illyrians and Celts fought side by side against Greek city-states or Roman incursions. There are records of Illyrian kings employing Celtic mercenaries, valuing their ferocity and skill with iron weapons. These alliances created hybrid communities, places where cultural lines dissolved, and one can no longer neatly say who was Illyrian and who was Celt. Even Rome, with its meticulous records, often struggled to make distinctions. Roman writers sometimes describe the same group of people as Celtic in one context and Illyrian in another. This inconsistency has fueled centuries of debate among modern scholars. Were the Romans simply confused, or was the reality that by this time, identities themselves had become fluid, tribal names less about ethnicity and more about political allegiance? Perhaps the strongest evidence of this cultural blending lies in the Balkans' role as a crossroads. To the east lay Thrace, to the south Greece, and to the west the Italic Peninsula. Into this melting pot came the Celts, merging, trading, and fighting with Illyrians. What emerged was not a simple replacement of one culture by another, but rather a mosaic of overlapping identities. So when we ask whether the Illyrians were Proto-Celts, we must grapple with the fact that by the time history shines its faint light on these peoples, their lives were already deeply entangled. Were the similarities due to ancient kinship, or the natural result of centuries of contact, conflict, and coexistence? The answer is not simple, and perhaps it was never meant to be. When Rome finally conquered the Balkans, the Illyrians faded as a distinct political and cultural force. Many were absorbed into the Roman legions, serving as soldiers across the empire. Others assimilated into provincial life, leaving behind their tribal identities. The Celts, too, were subdued, though their culture survived in Western Europe. Yet, even as these ancient names disappeared, the question of their relationship lingered, passed down to modern historians, linguists, and even nationalists. Today, the debate over whether the Illyrians were Proto-Celts is not just an academic curiosity. It touches on identity and heritage across Europe. Some scholars argue that the Illyrians and Celts were distant cousins, both born from the same Indo-European migrations thousands of years before history was written. In this view, their similarities in language, culture, and religion stem from a shared root, making the Illyrians one branch of the great Celtic family tree. Others reject this idea outright. They argue that the Illyrians were unique, an entirely separate people who developed their own culture in the rugged Balkans. To them, the similarities with the Celts are simply the result of contact, trade, war, and exchange, not evidence of shared ancestry. This camp warns against blurring lines too much, pointing out that the lack of surviving Illyrian texts makes it impossible to definitively connect them to the Celts. And then there is the controversial middle ground, that the Illyrians may not have been Proto-Celts, but that certain tribes among them were heavily Celticized to the point where their identities overlapped. This theory suggests that some Illyrian groups, particularly those near the Danube, became indistinguishable from Celtic tribes through centuries of intermarriage and alliance. In this view, the question of whether the Illyrians were Proto-Celts has no single answer. Some may have been, others not at all. What makes the debate especially intriguing is how modern nations connect to these ancient peoples. In the Balkans, Illyrian heritage is often invoked by Albanians, Montenegrins, Croats, and Bosniaks. Meanwhile, Celtic legacy is celebrated in places like Ireland, Scotland, and France. But if the Illyrians were Proto-Celts, then these legacies might not be so separate after all. It would mean that the story of the Celts is also, in part, the story of the Balkans, and that identities we treat as distinct today may have been far more interconnected in the deep past. So where does that leave us? The truth is, we may never have a definitive answer. With so little written evidence and archaeology open to multiple interpretations, the mystery will remain. But perhaps that is what makes the Illyrians so fascinating. They stand as a people on the edge of history, bridging the world of the Celts and the world of the Balkans, forever leaving us to wonder, were they truly the Proto-Celts, or something entirely their own?